Is your name,
My name is Ed Hoffman.
and why did you join the Navy?
At that time of life and that period of history, it was a thing to do. And I couldn't wait to get out of high school. I enlisted the day after high school graduation. And I had been raised on, my father had been a Marine, seagoing Marine. Made the trip around the world with Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. And I grew up on the stories of that. And even though my father was a Marine, it was more seagoing and all those stories, so I was attached to the background and the history of the Navy, and that's where I wanted to be, no matter what. So I enlisted the day after high school graduation. Some of my classmates had already enlisted before graduation, and initially I had enlisted in the Navy Air Corps, and went through all the tests and everything was fine, except they flunked me out on flat feet. So the enlistment, the recruiting officer at the Navy, at the post office, said no problem with that for us. So that's how I got in the Navy.
So what was the first ship you were on, and what was your role?
Well, the Emmons was my first and only ship, and I went aboard in Boston in August of 1943 when it had just come back from Scapa Flow and was tied up at the pier in Boston. It didn't look so pretty because it had been up there for a number of months, and the yard birds had already climbed all over it and had hoses and wires and things laying all over. And my first assignment was mess cooking. And I and two other fellows were assigned to that, and the first job was peeling potatoes. And the automatic peeler was broken. So we sat up behind number 2 stack and peeled potatoes, I think, for 2 or 3 days. Just long enough for me to know that I didn't want to stay down there, and I had inquired about getting into the signal gang or the bridge gang or something. I learned Morse code as a youngster and figured I could make some application of that, so I went up and talked to the chief and asked him if I could get into the signal gang, and yeah, it'll work out. So I became a signalman striker first, and I stayed in the signal gang, which was on the bridge at the navigation level, but it was on the outside, on the wings of the bridge, or back at the flag bag. And mostly I was doing the writing for the experienced signalman who could read the flashing light, read the flag hoist, and things that I hadn't learned yet. But I was gradually learning them, and then after I think our first trip to Newfoundland, my first trip was to Newfoundland, and when we came back, the one young quartermaster was transferred off for some reason, and I asked if I could take his place, and the chief said okay, and so I became a quartermaster, moved inside the bridge and more into the assisting on the navigation and helping with steering the ship, and keeping a watch over the helmsman, and keeping the log, and advising the officers when it was time to zig or zag according to whatever pattern we were on. And I had responsibility for all the ship's clocks. And at that time, every clock was a wind-up clock, and they all ran down in about 24 hours. So as long as I stayed on the ship, that was my job. I think I had 24 clocks that I had to wind. We would check, and we would set a stopwatch against with our chronometers, which we kept in the captain's sea cabin. And every week we'd take a time check with the Naval Observatory in Washington to make sure that our watches were right. or clocks, because time is a very precious part of navigation. And I would then take my stopwatch and mark the intervals and go to all the engineering spaces and all the compartments and all the staterooms and wind and reset if necessary all the clocks. So that was just, I had to do that off watch, so it wasn't part of my. It wasn't like I was on the time clock at that time. I was on my own time. But through that, I got to know everybody. And on a destroyer, there's usually a separation between the engineering force and the deck force and the bridge group, and everybody had their specialty, and they tended to stay together. But through that, I got to know everybody all around the ship. And of course, being in the quartermaster gang on the bridge, I would usually knew where we were going and what we were doing. And we would have to update the charts in advance when we were going to a new destination. And as a result of that, when I would go down to the engineering spaces, the guys were always anxious to hear what's the latest dope and what can you tell me, where we're going, how long we're going to be there. So, but I got on a friendly basis with almost everybody on the ship that way.
What was the U.S. Emmons? What kind of ship and what was its job in the war?
Well, the Emmons was a destroyer. It was a Benson-Gleaves class destroyer. And it was the Benson-Gleaves class of destroyers. I forget how many, 100 and some were built. But it was the last pre-war authorized class of destroyers. And to me, it was the most classic design, because it had the broken deck and just beautiful lines. And it was preceded by, way back, the old four-stack destroyers, many of which were sold to England in Lend-Lease, and some other, through the naval treaty days when shipbuilding was restricted by the armament treaties, some of the destroyers that were built weren't all that classy looking, in my opinion. But our class came along, I think, was the most beautiful. After that, the next class was the Fletcher class, which were always called the flush deckers, and they didn't look quite like ours, but we all had the same. Originally, destroyers were built to help in the surface action. They would be the outer screen, be the destroyers and the cruisers and the battleships. That was back in the old days of surface action. And as World War II evolved, that changed. In the early days of the South Pacific, the destroyers took a heavy loss, and some cruisers, because it was all night action and radar had not been developed the way it was later, and we lost a lot of destroyers and a number of cruisers. But then gradually the destroyers, in the Atlantic Fleet, the destroyers were convoy escorts and anti-submarine patrol vessels. And we did a good amount of that. That's when the Emmons, anytime we would go across the ocean, we would usually take a convoy along and escort them. And we would be on the outer ring, and we would go faster and come back and screen for submarines and go on the attack for submarines if any were detected. But because destroyers were built more with heavier armament equipment, it was tying up good fighting ships to guard very slow-moving convoys. And as a result of that, destroyer escorts were developed. They came about during the war, and they took the place of the destroyer that released us for other duty. And that's how we were in the bombardment group at Normandy, and later sent to the Pacific. But we were converted then into a destroyer minesweeper. And in my opinion, the whole purpose of our squadron was the first to be converted to destroyer fleet minesweepers. Some of the four stackers had been converted before that, but they were smaller and had less capable armament. But when they took our squadron and decided we were going to be fleet minesweepers, I'm sure that the real purpose was eventually to have swept the invasion channels into Japan. Okinawa came up first as supposed to be the last stepping stone invasion and battle before Japan. And if it hadn't been for the atomic bomb being dropped, our squadron probably would have been the first in there sweeping the invasion channels into Tokyo Bay. As it turned out, two of what remained of our squadron, the Ellison and the Macomb, were the first two ships into Tokyo Bay, escorting the Missouri for the signing of the armistice. But the destroyer changed during the course of the war because the war changed from surface action in the early days down the South Pacific as the carrier fleets took over, and it became an air battle. Even with all the surface vessels there, your big battleships and cruisers became more bombardment vessels, and the destroyers as well. But in the case of bombardment, we would screen them from the seaward side, but also take part in the bombardment. But the real surface actions in the latter part of the war, after Midway, were almost entirely fought in the air from carrier groups. And at that point, the destroyers were screening the carriers, giving them protection, and but then we were converted into minesweeper. But when we went to Okinawa, even though we were a minesweeper, after we swept the invasion channel, we went in on, I think it was March 24th, to sweep the invasion channel. Then we came back out, and from that point on, during the invasion, during the Battle of Okinawa, we operated as a destroyer again. And the destroyers at Okinawa were on picket duty, which meant they were outer early warning sites for space between Okinawa and Japan to warn of the air attacks that might be coming down. Unfortunately, the biggest one of all came on April 6th, and we happened to be in position. Two destroyers that were out on picket duty. We were not on picket duty at that time. We were screening small destroyers off the northwest coast of Okinawa. And the big attack that came down hit the outer pickets. The Bush and the Calhoun, which were both destroyers, were sunk first, and then they came in. That's when the Rodman got hit and we got hit. But we were actually screening other little minesweepers at that time. So our duties changed, and we were operating again as a destroyer, but with less armament than we were built to carry. We only had 3 5-inch guns where we needed 4, and we were like fighting a prize fight with one arm tied behind your back.
Let's talk about the battle and from the perspective of where you were when sort of the action started and what occurred after.
Well, I was in the pilot house. My general quarters station at that time, I just moved into that general quarters station, was in the pilot house on the engine order telegraph. The engine order telegraphs would set the speeds with the levers and telling the engine room what speed you wanted as the officer of the deck, or after we came under attack, the captain who took the control. And it was my job to respond to his command to set the speed at whatever he called for, or stop the engines, which he finally did after we were hit. And just to my left was the chief quartermaster. He was on the helm, on the wheel, and there was another quartermaster in there, a couple of talkers. I was also the captain's talker to the engine room, because I was handling the controls for the speed. And I had the sound-powered telephones on to talk to the engine room to tell them anything or answer any questions that came back for the captain if he wanted to give any special directions. When the attack came, the first was we saw and knew that the Rodman had been hit. And that's when we went to give her assistance. And we pulled up, I remember we pulled up on the port side, and they were fighting their fires. They'd been hit a couple times forward in the forecastle area. And I remember sitting out of the main battery director, looking out was Lieutenant Gilligan, who had just been transferred from our ship and was transferred to the Rodman as gunnery officer. And they were fighting the fires, and we offered to help, but because we were coming under more and more attack, the Rodman said, "We can handle our damage, we've got things under control, so take care of yourself," so to speak. And that's when we went into all kinds of evasive maneuvers as Captain Foss tried to maneuver the ship to avoid the attacking planes, and they were swarming at us from all directions. And when the first two hit, they hit in the fantail, and we were aware of it. And Chief Thompson, who was on the wheel, I remember saying, well, first of all, the captain was giving commands to right standard rudder, or left full rudder, or whatever, to avoid the incoming planes. We were too busy to see what was happening really, how many were being shot down, or how the gun batteries were doing. But at one point, Chief Thompson said the helm was not responding, which meant the indicator was not showing. As he turned the wheel, the rudder was not turning. So at that point, the captain said, "Shift to steering aft." We had a control there that you hit the bell and you could shift control to manual back in engines in the fantail. It would move the rudder according to our demands up on the ship, on the bridge. But unbeknownst to us, steering aft wasn't there. It had already been blown away. So we became, we only had power on one screw at that time, and the captain gave the control or the command to stop all engines. We stopped all engines, and I think that's about the time that the first plane hit the bridge. And the next thing was I woke up on my hands and knees, and everything was very red, and I knew I had to get out of there. So I got out to the wing of the bridge, and as I was going out the door, the opening over there, you had to go out to the port side because that's where the ladders were to go down below. And as I got over there, I realized I still had the headphones on with a wire connecting me. And I don't know how, but I got them off and got outside, and that's when I found out that my ankle had been smashed. And the inside ladders were a chimney of flame coming up. It couldn't go down inside, so I got around to I couldn't see who else was there. I think there might have been a signalman or two, but I couldn't recognize anybody. And I got around to the after part of the bridge and started to collect my senses. And by that time, the crew was coming down from the main battery up above. And that was Lieutenant Griffin, and of course he was the last one out. But the rangefinder operator and the pointer and the radar man, they all came down first, went down the ladder to the mast, an outside ladder. And I told Lieutenant Griffin, I said, "I can't walk, can you help me down?" he got behind me. We got down the ladder and got down to the main deck, and they got me in the water. Then somebody else was taking charge at that point of where I was going and what I was doing. And then I got picked up after a period of time. I was on the little life raft with several of the fellows. Ski, Ed Tostanowski, of course, and I don't remember who the others were. And the current was carrying us into the wreckage of the fantail, and we all had to paddle with, I think there were 2 paddles on the life raft and then a couple of boards, and we used them to try to get away from the current pulling us into the jagged after part of the ship, and we finally got free of that, and I don't know how long we floated around or whatever, but then I know it was dark by the time they were picking us up, and they got us on the little minesweeper and took care of us from there on.
Did you end up in a hospital after that?
Yeah, I went to, the little minesweeper took me down to Caramaretto and transferred me during the night to the Gosper, which was an auxiliary hospital ship. And I went across on a breeches buoy, Stoke stretcher. I think because my eyes were swelled shut and from the burns, and I didn't see or greet anybody as I went aboard. And I was on there 19 days, and of course we had medical care there. And eventually we took us to Guam, and my first hospital was in Guam. That's where I was with Armin Jolly. And he could walk around, and he would go get things for us, and that's where we got our Purple Hearts presented to us. And Armin in his pajamas, as I recall. But, we were there several weeks, and then they flew me to Hawaii. I was in a hospital in Hawaii for several weeks again. Then to the West Coast, to Oak Knoll Hospital. I was there a month and a half or something like that. Then to St. Albans in New York. And I was there, I think, 10 months. So it was a little over a year altogether I was in the hospital.
These reunions and the Emmons Association, why is that important to have an association and to have reunions?
Well, there was a special bond among shipmates. And of course what happened to the Emmons made that doubly special. And we had stayed together, and the fact that most of the crew originally had all come from New England, New York, Pennsylvania. We were all within close enough that buddies would visit each other, and we got to know each other's families and so on. And, the first couple of reunions back in the 50s were just the guys, and just rehashing old times. And then everybody went their separate ways to raise their families and make a living, and it wasn't until 1974 that Dave Jensen and Jerry McAlevey in New York got things back together again. And by then it was coming back with families. And then you were able to relate not just with your shipmates, but with your families, and everybody got to know each other. But the special bond that had always existed just became more and more important. And as we would acquaint our children with the story of the Emmons and the people that were so important in our lives, they got to know those people. And it grew into more of the importance of the tribute to the 60 men that we lost, and being able to perpetuate it. And we were so fortunate to have had Admiral Billingsley take the interest in the association, and the fact that he became a professor of history and wrote the Emmons saga which gave us a concrete historical record of what the Emmons had done. And the Emmons had just an extraordinary wartime record of being involved in things, all the way from diplomatic mission to on their shakedown cruise to South America, and invasions of South Africa, Normandy, southern France, trip to Murmansk, which, I mean, you hear about all these exploits of different groups of the Navy, but not one ship who had done all these things. And interspersed in with that was the hurry-up trip escorting President Roosevelt over to the conferences in Cairo and Tehran, and visiting, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 continents in the course of 5 weeks, I think it was. But things like that made the background of the history of the Emmons so important, and he put it into this beautiful history that gave us something to carry on with, and it became more and more important not to let the name of the Emmons die for just the sake of what the ship was, and for the memory of the men that we lost, and for everybody who had served on it. It just became so much more important, and it grew. It just grew and grew and grew.
How do you think the experience of being in the Navy and being on the Emmons helped shape your life after being in the Navy?
That's hard to say, because it was a time of coming back from World War II was trying to return to normalcy. And I think that was uppermost in everybody's mind, and that's what almost everybody did. And you didn't think all that much about it. I think, without realizing it, I think things in our lives became important without knowing, the discipline, the respect, the importance of doing the job you knew had to be done and when it had to be done, and what your role in it was, and the share of it that you had to carry in order for somebody else to do what they had to do. I think it made you more unselfish. And as we grew older, I think we came to appreciate that more and more. But it was certainly played a part in, even though it was get back to normalcy, you were doing it within a pretty, even though it was subconscious, structured way of going about everything.
What do you think is the most important thing that our grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren should take away from the lessons of World War II?
I think Tom Brokaw put it all into focus very, very well. Not that I'm looking for accolades as being part of the greatest generation, but I think he built something there that has been conveyed, and I think people accepted it and recognized that there are foundations here that go way, way back from the founding of the country, that were perpetuated, important enough for guys like me and the fellows that I served with to put out the effort they did, put their lives on the line if necessary, to protect the normalcy that we wanted to exist. And I think that's the most important thing.
That's all I have. Do you have anything else you wanted to say, Ed?
No.
Great.